In 2014, he was appointed as inaugural director of the Princeton Center for Language Study. Please welcome Jamie Rankin.
Thank you, Gunhild, and welcome to all of you here and those who are joining us via Zoom. I want to start off by sharing with you the 3 questions that will drive this talk. You can see these now. Just to make sure that I'm sharing the right thing. Here we go. What is the relationship between vocabulary, text coverage, and reading comprehension? What role does vocabulary currently play in L2 or second language textbooks? And how can research into L2 vocabulary inform classroom praxis? Before we launch into this, I want to explain a little bit of what the talk is and what it's not, what I hope it is and what it's not meant to be. It's not going to be a formal presentation of research with the usual discussion and results and methodology and so forth. It's not going to be an exhaustive review of the literature on second language vocabulary. That's an enormous field right now, growing exponentially. This is not going to be a formal presentation of that, but it will cite that as much as possible. What I'm aiming for here is sort of a synthesis of the research that I've come up with and found helpful in addressing the challenge of helping my students learn vocabulary, and then helpful in conceptualizing and designing the curriculum that Gunhild just mentioned. In the course of the talk, I'm going to be showing you this curriculum, but I want to make it very clear this is not a plug or it's not an advertisement for the curriculum. And even though it's all about vocabulary, in some ways it's not even meant to be that. What I'm trying to do is to sort of show a window into the attempt to integrate research into what happens in the classroom. So that's the goal, at least. We'll see how well that works. Now, let's begin. What do people expect to learn when they're learning a language? If you were to ask this question 100 years ago or look at textbooks from 100 years ago, there would be really just one answer, and that's grammar. To know a language was to know grammar. The syllabus was ordered around grammatical points. First you'd get, I have this from old German textbook, all the cases, chapter 1. And then you'd have all the tenses, you'd have lists of prepositions. Since then, of course, L2 pedagogy has undergone, I would say, a head-spinning number of shifts from 1960s audiolingual choral drills to the controlled chaos of classrooms that are using the natural approach back in the 80s and 90s, and I think still some today, to current trends around multilingualism, translanguaging, bilingual approaches, all kinds of things. Throughout these shifts, there has certainly been an acknowledgement about vocabulary, perhaps mostly, ironically enough, in the grammar translation era. But I'd say for the most part, these are the issues that people have cared about mostly, and that is accuracy, fluency, pronunciation, more recently, transcultural perspectives, critical pedagogies. And I would say that in some of these, and in some of the methodologies, there has been a conscious downplaying of the role of L2 vocabulary. This was the case certainly with audiolingualism with Lado and Fries, and more recently Wilger Rivers, who wrote against sort of working specifically on vocabulary. Now, you can see this in the seminal article that came out in 1980 from Canale and Swain. This was sort of the beginning of the communicative competence movement, theoretical basis of communicative approaches to second language teaching and testing. This was groundbreaking. They were trying to push people away from this focus on grammar, just on grammar, and they listed multiple competencies that people should have. The first being linguistic competence. I mean, they acknowledged that you needed to know grammar, and they also included lexical competence here, but it was not particularly emphasized. What was emphasized were the other pieces of the puzzle here. One was socio-linguistic competence, so that you weren't just saying things correctly, but you were saying things in the right context for the right social setting and doing that correctly. Discourse competence, and this would mean not that you were just making individual correct, grammatically correct sentences, but that you were able to do that in larger amounts, paragraph length, speaking and writing, with cohesion and coherence. Those are the 2 watchwords. And then strategic competence. And this was the ability to work around the gaps in your linguistic knowledge. You should be able to say what you want to say, even if you didn't know all the right words to it. So you can see in all of this that there was some emphasis on lexical competence with it was all grouped into linguistic competence, but not very much at all. The thrust of the article, in fact, was to move away from that and toward these other realms, which I think is also important. More recently, I want to take the example of Krashen's natural approach. And Krashen specifically said, this is in his 1983 book with Tracy Terrell, and I'll go ahead and read this because I think it's important. Just as a particular affective acquisition activity may entail the use of certain grammatical structures, the activity is not designed to teach that structure. The same is true of vocabulary. Activities are not necessarily vocabulary builders. Students' attention is not on vocabulary learning per se, but on communication, on the goal of an activity. In this way, we encourage true vocabulary acquisition. Those of you who are familiar with Krashen will know that just as grammar was meant to be learned inductively and naturally in a particular sequence, they felt the same thing about vocabulary. And so that's why he says this. Now, I would say that many commercial textbooks follow the same kind of trajectory. They downplay the use of vocabulary in order to emphasize other things. Why they do that is perhaps anybody's guess. I think it has a lot to do, and I'm just going to cite one of my favorite articles. It's an older article now. It's by Jack Richards, The Secret Life of Methods from TESOL Quarterly. 1984, old, but I think still timely. He argues that while we would like to think that good research leads to good textbooks, which in turn lead to good classroom methods, what ends up happening is more like a closed circle, that the textbook publishers make assumptions about teachers' methods because they know that teachers are going to buy the textbooks that are in line with those particular beliefs about language acquisition. And so you have this sort of closed loop of methods influencing textbooks, influencing methods, all of which is sort of an echo chamber where methods and textbooks all reinforce each other. And my point today is that they do this. They echo each other with scant acknowledgement of the research on both grammar acquisition and lexical acquisition. So I don't want to say that this loop has no value or that accuracy and these other elements have no value, but I just think that we need to be paying more attention to what's happening in the research on vocabulary acquisition. So meanwhile, in England in the 1930s, you had a guy named Michael West who wrote, "The primary thing in learning a language is the acquisition of a vocabulary and practice in using it, which is the same thing as acquiring." And he's adopting the same language as Terrell and Krashen 50 years later. The problem is what vocabulary? And none of these modern textbooks in common use in English schools have attempted to solve the problem. And this is sort of the crux of the problem. Which vocabulary are you supposed to be learning? So this is the issue that I began looking at in order to address the problem that I saw among our students learning German. We did not have problems, I would say, with interaction or fluency. People were able to talk with each other. They were able to converse. We did that. The problem had largely to do with the students' frustration at the massive amount of vocabulary that confronted them as they were looking at texts later on after the initial language sequence. And so my reading on the topic has led me to ask sort of a couple of questions that people have been asking ever since then. Basic questions, as you'll see. How many words do people know? And by people here, I mean native speakers, L1 speakers. How many words do they know? As a way of determining how many words L2 learners need to learn. It's one question. And the other is, how do these words, the particular words that people know, how do they figure in questions of textual coverage and therefore in developing L2 reading competence? Now, a sidebar, just you may know all this, some of you may not, and the people who are tuning in via Zoom may or may not. When I say, how many words do people know? What do we mean by the word word? It may seem straightforward. It's not always straightforward. Let me make sure I've got this done right. If we have the word, for instance, agree, then here's a question. That's one word, clearly. Agrees, agreeing, agreed. Is that 3 or 4 words, or is it just one word? That's pretty simple. I think we'd agree that's one word, no pun intended. However, if we have something like bring and the past tense brought, is that one word? or those two items that people have to learn. Not quite as straightforward. In any case, the people who do this kind of word counting have come up with a couple of terms. One is the term lemma, which you may or may not know. The lemma would be all the forms, all the inflected forms of a given word. So for agree, this would be agree, agrees, agreed, and agreeing. That would be the lemma of agree. And then they also talk about word families. And the word family for agree would be all of the lemmas that belong to agree, plus all the words that could be built around the word. So that would include agreeable, disagreement, what else? You can help me here. And things like that, disagreeing and so forth. It could be all of these words. So we can ask then, how many lemmas, or lemmata, as I think that's the right plural, how many lemmas do people actually know? The Oxford English Dictionary lists 600,000 lemmas. We know that many of these, the vast majority are archaic, extremely specialized. And more recently, and I think more helpfully, Golden, Nation, and Reed did a study of Webster's Third International Dictionary. I think I can safely get rid of all this now. And asked themselves how many word families are in Webster's, which would give us more of an idea about how the English language or American English works. And they came up with the figure of 54,000 word families, a lot of words. This, by the way, raises an interesting question for all of us as language instructors. When you talk about a word family, an agree, disagree, agreement, can instructors assume that if a learner has learned one word in a word family, that this learner can then extrapolate from that to other words within the word family? I know that many instructors, including me, have assumed that students can and should do this. But in fact, there have been studies recently, one of them was with Schmidt and Zimmerman, 2002, that learners aren't very good at doing this. And I would say from my own experience learning German, with good reason. Sometimes it's pretty clear how a word should work and how a word might work in a larger family. But then certainly in German, there are words that seem to be the same with a small suffix. I won't go into the details here, but people who know German would understand that ankommen, sort of to arrive, with kommen, to come, and umkommen, to die, you could make pretty egregious error thinking that they might be in the same word family. So with good reason, people are a little skeptical of assuming that something in a word family might extrapolate. And so they have to learn more words. But anyway, back to the question. How many words do native speakers know? There was a recent study that showed that the average native speaker at age 4 knows about 5,000 lemmas. And that the average native speaker at age 8 knows about 10,000 lemmas. Schmidt and Schmidt, this is the book that came out in 2020, just last year, and I think is one of the best compendium. By the way, I have a bibliography prepared, and I'll send that to everybody who would like it. I'll give it to Angelika so she can distribute that. They assume, on balance, it seems that the average educated L1 English speaker knows broadly 10,000 to 13,000 word families. Now, to put that in context of language teaching, the average college student emerging from the first year of L2 instruction has been exposed by way of most commercial textbooks to about 1,500 active vocabulary words. These are the words that would be included in the list of active vocabulary someplace in the chapter. But chances are that most of these words, and in some cases, over half of these words, will appear one time only in that list and never be seen again for the rest of the book, so that the effective working vocabulary that students take out of an American German textbook, I know the German market, none of the others, but I'm guessing that the others are about the same, that what you're actually taking away is more like 500 to 600 words, because these are the words that will be used again and again in natural language production and in the texts that people encounter there. So then we have to ask ourselves, how many words do students need to know in that case? And this comes down to a more nuanced thing. Of interest to me, just as I'm thinking, how can I help my students? We have to ask the question, when we ask this question, what do they need to know for which language function? Because not all functions are going to be the same. So for instance, if you talk about listening for everyday communication, you may get one answer listening for specialized domains such as films, lectures, reading the news, or not reading, listening to the news on television or podcasts. What about speaking? How many words do they need to know for that? What about writing? And then what about reading? And I just want to give you a very brief summary of some of what's been looked at for each one of these functions. So for listening to everyday communication, von Zelen and Schmidt, they stipulate that you need to know about 95% of the words in conversation, which in practice, from the transcripts they've made, means about 2,000 to 3,000 word families. So we're coming down a little bit from 10,000 to 13,000. For more specialized complex domains, the research by ISP Nation suggests that you need to know almost all of the words in these. These would be specialized words, 98%. And looking at transcripts of these, you probably need to know 6,000 to 7,000 word families and proper nouns. What's interesting is that in speaking and writing, the statistics are very difficult to come by, because when people are speaking and writing, they are in control of the words that they're using. And so you can't quite specify. We know from our students, I'm sure you have seen this in your classes, students with a limited amount of vocabulary are still able to express a lot. They can develop a voice, they can say things, they have strategic competence, to use Canali and Swain's metaphor. Writing is the same way, they can get things across. So this is not, it's actually not quite as hard. Reading, on the other hand, reading is hard because you're not in control of what you're looking at. You're confronting these words. Beecher Laufer and Ravenhorst Kolofsky in 2010, they called for 2 thresholds. And they would say that to be minimally fluent as a reader in an L2, you need to know about 95% of the words, which comes to 4,000 to 5,000 word families. So not totally fluent, but able to get through the text reasonably well. And to be an optimal reader, you need to know 98% of the words. So 8,000 to 9,000 word families, which is in line with Norbert Schmidt's more recent article. I think it's just about, actually it came out about the same time as this, that he cited 9,000 to 10,000 word families for fluent reading. It's a lot of words. Now, let's keep going here. When researchers say you need to know, let's say 8,000 to 9,000 words, they don't just mean any words, as if learning the first 9,000 words in Webster's third dictionary would work. I don't know if have you ever seen the movie Small Time Crooks? It's a Woody Allen movie. The character played by Tracy Ullman, brilliantly played by her, decides she wants to speak in a more sophisticated way than her New Jersey upbringing brought her to speak. And so she begins memorizing words starting with A in the dictionary and begins in every scene using words like apposite and antithesis. And you may want to watch it. The idea of which words to use is a difficult issue. And it was addressed by the people around Michael West in Britain back in the 1930s in what was then called the vocabulary control movement. And they were looking at this question: what words do we need to teach L2 learners in order to maximize their ability to deal with text and with speaking? They came up with criteria for which words it should be: word frequency, structural value. In other words, they should learn the function words, prepositions, conjunctions, that sort of thing. They should strive for universality, so no offensive words. Subject range, no specialist words. They should be teaching them the definition words that they would encounter in a dictionary in order to find more difficult words. Word building capacity, which I assume means that words that could be joined together or collocated together. And then style and register, so there should be no slang words. As soon as you look at this, you may be thinking, who is going to decide what is an offensive word? Who is going to decide what's a specialist word? What is slang? What is not slang? I mean, the one thing that was the durable element in all of this was word frequency. And this has become the gold standard for how this kind of research has been done since then. So this is what I want to focus on, since it seems to me that it's profoundly important for what we do as we teach. Now, how do you calculate word frequency in a given text? Or not in a given text, in a corpus of text for the whole language? What you have to do is to analyze a large and strategically chosen corpus of text. You have to decide which kind of text you're going to use. It's going to be the New York Times, but not just the New York Times. It's going to also be transcriptions of spoken speech. It could be rental agreements. it could be tweets, it could be all kinds of things. You take running words, you lemmatize them so that words like agrees, agreeing, and agreeing just come up as one word, one lemma, and then you rank them in frequency. Routledge has done this and has done it very effectively for about a dozen different languages, including German. And these lists, in turn, these lists of ranked frequencies, the ranked words in frequency, have given rise to a very specific kind of research into the relationship between frequency and text coverage. And this is what I want to focus on here. Now, when researchers look at this, when they talk about these frequencies, what they generally do is talk about bands of words. And so you'd go from number 1 to number 1,000. This would be the first band of words. And in English, any guesses as to what number 1 is? It's the same word for Spanish, French, German, and English. What's that? Not to be. That's number 2 or 3. The, right? So the number 1 is the word the, or its equivalent in other language. And I just looked this up in the most recent list of these. Number 1,000 in English is the word cause. The second band would be from 1001 to 2000. And then this happens to be, if you're interested, the word 10 to the word virtually. Yeah, and then 2001. So this is band number 1. This is band number 2. 2000 to 3000 would be band number 3. And this would be root and vulnerable. And it goes on from there. These have been analyzed for quite a bit for years now. And they pose these questions. Once these lists have been made up, then the question was posed, what happens if you know the first band? How much of a text can you read? If you know the 2 bands, if you know the 2,000 most frequent words, what kind of text coverage do you get? This was looked at by, this kind of thing, in terms of deciding what the bands were, was done in what was called the Brown corpus. This was researchers at Brown University. They compiled what's now known officially as the Brown University Standard Corpus of Present-Day American English. This is 1967. And it included 500 samples from 15 different genres of text. It was all written, not transcriptions of spoken English, but it was 500 samples from 15 genres. And the genres were things like literature, periodicals, books about humor, books about hobbies. They tried to get as much range as possible. And they put together about 1 million words of running text. Subsequent to that, Carol Davies and Richmond, in 1971, so just a few years after that compilation, they took a look at text coverage of each successive 1,000 words. In other words, they matched the Brown corpus with what had been done in frequency. And this is what I want to talk about. What did they come up with? First thing they noticed was the first band actually gave you 72% of the Brown corpus. So across the corpus, all these different genres, 72% of the text was covered by the top 1,000 words. When they went to the second band of coverage, sorry, I keep running into this. Second band of coverage, you got another almost 8%. And then as you kept going down to more and more words and what was being covered, you could see it went from 8% change to just over 4% change, 2.7, 1.9. And so you can see, if I can draw this here, that the line kind of goes like this. In other words, this first 1,000 gives you an immense amount. And then with each successive 1,000, you just get less and less and less, until you finally get to, let's say, 9,000 or 10,000. But the critical number was, of course, this first 1,000 words. This was the first of many studies like this. This has been done again and again with different languages and with different corpuses and much larger corpuses. And they keep coming to the same conclusion, that with the first 1,000 or so, you end up with 70 to 75% of coverage from the text. It's now a fairly non-controversial figure. Now, there are a lot of caveats to this. It does not cover poetry. It wouldn't cover very specialized texts. And you have to remember that if you just know the first 1,000, you're not a fluent reader. In other words, you only know 3/4 of the words, so that every fourth word on average would not be known. And in many of these texts, I would say the most important words are the words you do not know. But you know all the function words. And this is, I think, the critical thing, that as you're reading along, you are not stymied and distracted by all of the function words that you might not know, which allows you then to focus on the important content words that do come up. So with this in mind, we next have to ask the next question: what words are students in fact learning from their college textbooks, right? Now, I can only answer this with regard to German and only with regard to the American market, because those are the textbooks I know about the best. And I do this thanks to the meticulous work of a researcher, Silke Lipinski, who published an analysis in Unterrichtspraxis about 10 years ago, where she took the 3 top sellers. I think I have a list of them here. Yeah, this is the article she wrote, Frequency Analysis of Vocabulary in 3 first-year textbooks of German. And she looked at these 3, Deutsch heute, Kontakte, Neue Horizonte. So German today, contacts, new horizons, very well known. They've been established. They've been around for quite a while. And she compared their active vocabularies with the top ranked 1,000 band in the 2006 version of the ranked list that came out through Routledge. Now, what are the results? This was her research question. What is the relationship of the words presented in the active vocabulary list of these 3 books with the 4 frequency bands listed in the Jones-Tschirner Frequency Dictionary? And this is what she came up with. So you can see, so the white band is here, Deutsch heute, cross that way is Kontakte, and the mottled one would be Neue Horizonte. And so for the first band, which is what I'm mostly interested in, Deutsch heute had 637 of the top 1,000. Kontakte had 530, and Neue Horizonte had 605. And then as you can see, as the bands go down, predictably, they have fewer and fewer words from that band. What's amazing to me is that there are so few of that 1,000. I mean, if those 1,000 are actually what give you the highest amount of literacy right off the bat, how does that work? And then the other interesting thing to me, see, this is the band of total Lemate for Kontakte, 2,100 plus active vocabulary words. That's a lot of words for the first year text. But 953 of those are beyond the 4,000 mark, which means they're totally authentic words, but they are words that users will not encounter that often following that. And I would say, having looked through the book pretty carefully, they are words that come up in one chapter and then are forgotten for the rest of the text, except probably about the 500 or 600 words that come up naturally, because these are the words that keep coming up all the time from that top 1,000. So with this in mind, I began asking myself, would it be possible to come up with a curriculum that had what you need to have, cultural topics, a full coverage of the grammar that is normally covered in first-year German, but also with a focus on vocabulary, and strategically done so that you're looking at vocabulary often over the course of the text and with the right vocabulary. So I decided to explore this possibility, and I went out. My first step was I went out and I bought 1,200 Post-it notes in different colors, and I wrote out each one of the words and then spent one spring break doing this. I went to one of our rooms, and I and a colleague came up with potential chapter topics. This is like a sort of a 4-dimensional puzzle that you're putting together, because you have to think, can you organize these 1,200 words, not just the words that I think would be useful, but these 1,200 words, can you organize those in such a way that you could spread them across chapters of cultural interest and do so in a way that honors the grammatical presentation as it follows, because all of these things play a role. So I spent a week putting this together and decided it could work. And I came up with, I'll share just a little bit of this with you while we have time. What we're calling Der, die, das. It's called Der, die, das, because I got frustrated trying to come up with some metaphoric name like New Horizons in German today. And I just decided to go with the first entry in the Jones-Chioner vocabulary ranked list, which is the. So these are the three ways of saying the in German. So when students encounter it, they see this is the home page. It has some very commonly used topics, sports, cities. Mallorca is not as common. But I decided we would have something about that because fully 10% of the German population flies to Mallorca every year. That and things like how do Germans experience Sunday? It's very different in multiple ways than we do. The Autobahn, right. So I'm going to focus on one of these just to give you, this is the one on Heimat, which is a fraught word. It doesn't quite mean home and it doesn't quite mean homeland. And it's a very rich and a very problematic word in German because of mid-20th century history and because then of the richness of Romantic poetry before that and Schumann and Schubert. There's all sorts of things. So we do this. I'll just show you kind of the text. I want to show you just the basic structure of it and then show you how vocabulary is mixed with this. Each one of these, each chapter has 4 subtopics. So this is what is Heimat, being at home, which is a more traditional approach to what you have in your environment, what kinds of rooms are there, because a lot of these come up in the high frequency vocabulary. And then Heimat and politics. And here's where we try to delve a little deeper into some of these rather fraught questions of German history. And then Heimweh, so home pain, which is the word for homesickness, which is also a robust and rich topic in German poetry over the centuries. For each one of these, you will have, I'll go back to the first one here, a number of what we're calling just interactions. And these are text in some kinds. There are audio tapes where people talk about the concept of home. There are some statistics on this. This is a text about a writer from Cameroon who was in Austria and tries to put together what does it mean to be from Cameroon, trying to be in Austria. How much overlap is there? How much overlap is there not? And then you know, the sense, this uneasy sense that a lot of, especially young people in Austria have with the concept of home because it's been mythologized and put up on a pedestal by some and misused by some. So this is a parody of people seeing it. You'll notice in all of these that there are some highlighted words. So here, I'm not sure you'll be able to hear this, but
kann, besonderen, Gesellschaft,
these words that are highlighted in color are words that are in the core vocabulary. And every word from that 1200 appears somewhere embedded. It's not just in a list, it's embedded in something. But you can also see it here. Now, I think people at home are not going to be able to see that, people on Zoom, but if actually you can't see it either. Let me think. I think I can show this to you. Yeah, so when you click on that, yeah, that gives you in list format. And we do it in list format and in the embedded format because the research shows that some people learn better through lists and some people learn better through embedded contextualized words. These are all clickable so that you can hear a native speaker saying them. And I'll go through a little bit later why particular words are grouped together as they are. But these are the ways that people can access the vocabulary. I'll go back to this. We also here in a text like this and the ones that follow introduce a particular grammatical structure. Here it's modal infinitives or modal verbs. And these are all in German, though anything that is highlighted like this or that has the little asterisk, you can put a tooltip on top of it and then you can get the meaning for that. But the students can sort of forget that and they can just go through the whole text in German. The idea is to raise consciousness of the grammar that's there, have them work on the vocabulary, and then later go into the structures. This is where they would get the grammar, and then there's full commentary in English with German exercises, followed up by another set of interactions with more aspects of this. I think this is where we have, yeah, this is the Eichendorff poem from the early 19th century. And then we have connected with this 2 different, the Schumann and the Brahms setting of this particular poem, so they can listen to that if they want to. The first interaction in this second is always vocabulary recycling. And this is an attempt over the course of the book to keep reviewing some of the non-cognate words that come up so that students don't just see them once, they have to process them a couple of times. So looking at the clock here to see how much we should go through. These are my attempts, and I'm going to give you now, I'll go back to PowerPoint. Yeah, I want to go back now to some of the concepts that we were working with as to how to present this, how to make it as learnable as possible for students, and this is what we've come up to. There's a lot of research, and I'm just summarizing it quickly here, but I hope this is helpful, that the presentation of L2 vocabulary should be explicit and deliberate, not merely incidental. So this goes right against Stephen Krashen's directives. There are research studies that show that you can have incidental vocabulary learning, but that works much, much better for very advanced students. At the very beginning, it needs to be explicit and intentional, certainly to get that first 2,000 or 3,000 word family under wraps. It should entail multiple sensory inputs, both visual and auditory. And so this is why we have them in print, why you have a tooltip, why you can click on it and listen to it, and why we have audio that gives it to you once again. This was a surprise to me in the research, but I find it very intriguing. That L2 vocabulary is best learned in thematic sets rather than semantic sets. A semantic set would be what we're all used to in commercial textbooks where you said days of the week, buildings in a city, objects in a classroom, articles of clothing, where you have a rubric and then all of the examples. That is a semantic set, and that's how most textbooks approach this. A thematic set, on the other hand, is where you take a topic and you think of all the vocabulary that you could pull together to talk about that topic. And so if you were looking at the list that I put up, this is definitely not a semantic set, but a thematic set. Every thema, every subtopic in the chapter is its own thematic set. And I have just a quote from the more recent study. Contrary to frequent practice in many course books, presenting new vocabulary that belongs to the same semantic set together may cause interference due to cross-association and may even hinder vocabulary learning. Now, I think that between, say, German and English, there are so many cognates between the two that that's not such of an issue. But if I, as a native American English speaker, were trying to learn, say, Chinese or Arabic, it's very possible that as I was learning days of the week or objects in a room, I would know that it's in that list, but I would forget which one of those things in the list it might be. And it's actually more useful if I can visualize the topic to then talk about it using those elements. It should involve receptive as well as productive tasks. And these are the exercises that we have throughout the curriculum. Some receptive things where receptive means that they see in our case, the German word, and they have to do something with it to show that they know what it means. They recognize it. Productive task means that we may give them an English word and they have to recall the German word, or that they have to make use of their whole mental lexicon to try to come up with something that's written. It requires multiple meaningful exposures. To me, this is now Susanna Roth, the University of Illinois in Chicago, has written about this a lot, and I find this very compelling. Students need to see words and process words again and again and again if they're going to really get these words. Seeing them once in a list from a chapter is not going to do it for most students. There may be some who can, but for most students, that's not going to work. And lastly here, learners should be encouraged to create multiple connections. In other words, they need to know how to pronounce the words. They need to know their meanings, their association with topics, images, auditory input, and related vocabulary words. This kind of multiple levels of processing really does help to get the words more anchored in the memory and to have more just synaptic connections that people can use in order to get the words. So I'm looking at the time now, it's 4:45, it's warm in here. You've been very attentive, thank you. I think I'm gonna stop there, and I'd love to have comments, questions, anything you'd like to share or ask about this. Yeah, let me just repeat the question for those who may not have heard it. I talked about just a small sample of, well, the small sample, but the most significant German American textbooks, that is American publishers publishing German textbooks. And the question is, would that apply equally, does that situation apply equally to other languages, say French, Italian, Chinese? I don't know, but my anecdotal sense from having spoken with instructors and students is that it seems to. And I don't know, I mean, you people are teaching, so what would you say? And I'm not meaning to be judgmental about anybody's textbook. I just, I'm curious to know what's out there. I don't know of any other analyses that have been done that compare. I know the Routledge series of ranked frequency, they have it for, I know they have it for Mandarin Chinese, for French, Spanish, German, Arabic, Portuguese, Japanese. But I haven't looked at other textbooks to see, and I don't know enough of the, especially other orthographies, to be able to compare what's out there with what's in the textbooks. So I just don't know. I haven't heard of anything else that is like this. But I think what you said is very important. And all of the people writing about this agree, you can't teach students 9,000 words. So they would all say, students need to pick this up on their own. The question is, how do they start out? And so most of the people writing about this would advocate for intentional strategic work at the very beginning. So do you get kind of a threshold? Beisha Laufer talks about a threshold of about 2,000 to 3,000 words. And then you just encourage people to listen and to read and to look and to see what's interesting to them. And they have to add to that on their own. There's no way that you could have a strategic way of doing 9,000 words, especially say in the first couple of years. But our goal is to get 2,000 words, 2,000 lemmas over the course of 4 semesters. So Der die Das covers 1,200 words, and I just chose that arbitrarily. It's 16 chapters times 80 words a chapter, it comes out to 1,200. So then we do another 400 words in the Jones-Chioner book in the 3rd semester, and another 400 in the 4th semester. We have a 4-semester sequence. But it's an interesting question, because I think that's a very valid point, that the idea of being more interventionist in choices about vocabulary doesn't make sense. I just know from our own experience that when we tell our students, and I know your students are the same way, we're not asking you to do something that's random. In other words, if you have to learn these words, however you ask them to learn them, we're giving you tools that will help you, that'll push your literacy levels. And if they begin to see that they can, from the very beginning, read more headlines, they can go to the German equivalent of the New York Times and begin reading some of these articles, which some of our students, they get very excited. They said, yes, I can see I'm reading things and I'm learning the words that I actually encounter, which was just not the case before. There may be other textbooks that do that well. I just know that our textbook and the way we were doing it was not doing that. I'm glad you mentioned that. There's a lot of controversy about this. People feel like, we should be using the L2 for everything that's going to be immersive. And in fact, there was a study, I think it's from 2018, Lee and Levine, which I've listed on the bibliography that I'll make sure everybody can get, that looks at how well students learn words if they are glossed in the L2 or glossed in the L1. And it turns out they just do much better if they're glossed in the L1. The idea of clarity of meaning is very important to sort of anchoring the word. And of course, the instructor has to make choices, as we constantly have to do. For my own practice, and I tell my TAs to use a single word gloss is okay. What I don't want is connected syntax where you're explaining things in English, if you can get away with that. But a single word gloss is the best way to go. If somebody says, I came across the word Tisch, which is table, if you can point to it, then you don't need to say the word. But if they say they came across the word Gerechtigkeit, justice, then, trying to go, and I've heard my TAs do this, they go into mental gymnastics, linguistic gymnastics, trying to explain this. They lose the students. They are frustrated because they can tell the students aren't following them. And so it's just demonstrably better in a well-done study to use the English gloss. So that's what I do. Right, I don't know if everybody on Zoom could get this. The question is about learning collocations and words in a particular context, that words frequently fall together, used that way. That's a very, very valid and good question, and hard to carry out in teaching. Exactly. I will say that for this textbook, I made sure that we taught some of the standard collocations of verbs with prepositions, and that kind of collocation, or sort of nouns with verbs that go together a lot. That's not quite the same thing, but we do teach those. And I just practically speaking, it seems that the collocations, which with some words can be almost endless because they're used in so many different ways. I feel like that's where students just need to be reading and hearing and listening. But if there were an intentional way where you could get the chunks of words and keep it to a workable size at the very beginning, that would be a great thing. We don't do it beyond the kind of formal collocations of to wait for and to be interested in and that kind of thing. But yeah, that would also be helpful. It's how you would package it. I'm just not sure how that would work. As much as possible. I mean, one example that comes up just because it comes, oh shucks, because you see it so often. You know, there's the word gar in German, but I would say that 9 times out of 10 it's going to come up with gar nicht. And that actually is so frequent that that's a separate item in the frequency list. Gar nicht is listed as a collocation. But yeah, how to do that in a strategic way over the course of the semester with certain words. Be an interesting study to see if you could isolate the ones that are most frequent and include those with the definitions. Yeah. It's 5 o'clock.
So I think let's take the question by Paul.
Okay.
He's asking if you can apply the principles to any language and use the methods. If you do them, how long would it take to learn?
Well, which student and which language? I think a lot of it has to do with the L1, L2 issue. I mean, we know that. And you also have to be careful that learning this vocabulary doesn't mean you're learning the language. I mean, you still have to learn syntax. You have to learn morphology. You have to learn how words go together and word order. What this does is allows people, it gives people a larger sight vocabulary. So as they're reading through a text, they just recognize more words and they don't trip over the words. We all know what it feels like as second language learners. You just trip over words you don't know and you stumble in meaning. And you go back and you look that one up and then you look up the next one. And by the time you get to the end of the phrase or sentence, you've forgotten what the first one was about. I mean, that's what I think this is really helpful for. But, you know, how long it takes to learn a language, I have no answer to that. Certainly several years. And I know from our own experience teaching Spanish, teaching German, teaching Chinese, they're just harder. It's harder for English L1 speakers to learn Chinese than certain other languages, right?
And actually, you know what I do like Anna's question, and I'm interested in the answer to that too. Anna is asking, what inspired you to learn German?
What inspired me to learn German? Well, I tell my students this, it was the language requirement. Though it wasn't that inspired me to learn German per se. I was a music major. And I loved the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, which I pronounced Bach, until I learned German. Beethoven, Liszt, Brahms, and I thought I'd like to learn that. And in fact, there's a very specific time. I was in 9th grade. I didn't start learning German until college, so I started late. I was a sophomore in college. But in 9th grade, I first became acquainted with the Bach St. Matthew Passion. And the very first chorus, I had a wonderful old recording of it, and they had the German text and the English text. And the first couple of words are, it's just word, word, word in German and word, word, word in English. And I thought, this is easy. Kommt ihr Töchter, helft mir klagen. You know, and so I thought I could learn this. And so when it came time to learn a language, I'd heard that the German teacher was good at my college. I wanted to learn about German music, so I did it.
Well, everybody, help me in thanking Jamie, and I'm going to step to the microphone so people can hear.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks to all of you for joining us today.
I put the link to our feedback request in chat, and that will also go out via email tomorrow. The next speaker is on Monday, October 4th, so please mark that in your calendars. We have lots of thank yous rolling in here on chat. So thanks everybody for coming today. Enjoy this week, and we will see you soon. Thank you.